It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 11136. For what purpose the gentleman from Florida rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 111-36, offered by Mr. Mack of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 235, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mack, and a member opposed each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I would first like to thank Chairman Oberstar and Ranking Member Micah for all their efforts to promote clean water and infrastructure investment. Despite these good efforts, I find it hard to believe that the majority would include a job-killing provision known as Davis-Bacon in this legislation. Mr. Chairman, with Davis-Bacon and the majority's introduction of the card check legislation earlier this week, the Democrat leadership is telling big labor that they're open for business and it's time to cash in on the backs of the hardworking American taxpayers. As members of Congress, one of our jobs is to make certain that our country has safe, accessible, and modern infrastructure. It is our responsibility as legislators to foster a competitive environment that enables businesses to hire the workers they need and to meet these goals. Sadly, this is a bill we should all be able to support, but with the poison pill of Davis-Bacon provision, this becomes unacceptable legislation, and I, in good faith, cannot support it. The Davis-Bacon Act, passed in 1931, is a throwback to failed Depression-era economic policies and is fiscally irresponsible. Davis-Bacon is basically a federally mandated super minimum wage provision that applies to federally funded projects, infrastructure projects. Davis-Bacon provisions force construction projects to deal with unnecessary red tape and lead to higher construction costs. It ensures that wages are artificially set by bureaucrats, not by the free market forces. Currently, 18 states, including my home state of Florida, have no prevailing wage laws. With the inclusion of Davis-Bacon, my constituents, along with 17 other states, will see increased costs of public construction, thereby reducing the volume of projects and jobs. Mr. Chairman, I stand up for Florida and other states today. Do not burden them with this reckless policy. This bill today represents an unprecedented expansion of Davis-Bacon. The Clean Water Investment Act mandates that any project funded, even in part, by the State Revolving Loan Fund is subject to the prevailing wage requirements. To be blunt and simple, Davis-Bacon is fiscally irresponsible policy and should not be included in this legislation. Repealing Davis-Bacon would save taxpayers billions in construction and administrative costs. These numbers may seem trivial to some of my colleagues, especially in this time where the majority has spent more than $1 trillion in the last month. But to my constituents, this is completely unacceptable. If we repeal Davis-Bacon, we could use these savings to create more jobs and improve our water supply rather than just lining the pockets of big labor. I cannot believe that members can sit back and allow this provision to be part of the underlying legislation. Our taxpayers deserve better. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
I claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield myself 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
It's always astonishing to me over the 35 years now I've served in the House that on those few occasions when prevailing wage has become an issue of discussion on the House floor, it is characterized as job killing and union boss wages and other such, not that the gentleman from Florida used such language, but it has been used on other occasions. Far from job killing. Good Lord, this was provision signed into law by Herbert Hoover on March 3rd, 1931, in response to an appeal from contractors who said that job-stealing contractors from other parts of the country were coming into New York on Long Island, where a federally funded hospital is being built, and undercut their wages. And that was pretty hard to do in those days because the wage was only about 25 cents an hour, and set up tents on the property where the construction project was underway to undercut the local contractor, who then appealed to the administration for help. Didn't get any, but the local Republican member of the House, Mr. Bacon, vigorously protested that practice. The Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Mr. Davis, left the administration, went back to Pennsylvania, was elected to the United States Senate, and in 1931 joined with Mr. Bacon, moved this legislation through the House, the Senate, and Herbert Hoover signed it into law. It has not killed jobs in over 70-some years. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in strong support of this amendment. Inclusion of a Davis-Bacon mandate in H.R. 1262 represents both bad policy and bad process, and I support this effort to correct it. First, on process. The Education and Labor Committee, the committee with jurisdiction over Davis-Bacon, never considered the bill's Davis-Bacon provision, not in a hearing, not in a markup, not in any procedure whatsoever. If we had, we would have weighed the impact of this provision on the projects themselves, on local economies, and indeed on the American taxpayers. And that brings me to my second objection, the policy. By inflating labor rates, Davis-Bacon typically increased the cost of federal projects by anywhere from 5 to 38%. Furthermore, the costs of Davis-Bacon are particularly burdensome for small businesses. This mandate can saddle private companies with literally millions of dollars in excess administrative work every year. Small, locally owned businesses can't afford this type of bureaucracy. They rarely have the resources to comply. As a result, large companies are more often rewarded government contracts, even for small projects. At a time when the economy is hurting as it is, and small businesses are the ones that are creating jobs, give them the opportunity to do it. Federal law should not have a built-in bias against small businesses. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and remove the costly and burdensome Davis-Bacon requirement, and I yield back, balance my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Minnesota.
I yield 2 minutes, distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop, member of the committee.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the amendment, and I rise particularly noting that Congressman Bacon at one point represented New York 1, the district that I have the honor of representing. I want to be clear on what our friends on the other side of the aisle are fighting for. The prevailing wage for a bricklayer in Lee County, Florida, is $8.34 an hour. That's an annual rate of $17,000 a year. The federal poverty level for a family of 4 is approximately $21,000 a year. Does this Congress really want to go on record as imposing a wage rate that consigns the hardworking people of our communities to living under the federal poverty level? I would hope not. The prevailing rate for a backhoe operator in Madison County, Arkansas, is $12.17 an hour. Is that a wage that we can find indefensible? Is that a wage that is going to bankrupt the companies that hire these people? Absolutely not. An annual rate of $25,000 a year, how do we help our families get their piece of the American dream when we consign them to wages as low as $17,000 a year or $25,000 a year? So I would urge my colleagues to both reject this amendment and to make a statement that we want to support the working families of our communities. We want to see to it that they are paid a livable wage, and we want to ensure, frankly, that we don't give opportunity to unscrupulous contractors who will not be bound by federal prevailing wage requirements, and they will then access a workforce that is willing to accept the subsistence wages and no benefits that would go along with such a job. We have an immigration system that's
Gentleman,
broken.
time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the gentleman from Florida for yielding. This is an issue that will bring me to this floor every opportunity I get. I believe I would be the one member of this Congress that has lived underneath the oppressive burden of the Davis-Bacon Act the longest and been impacted by it the most. There's a second-generation King construction that's impacted by this now, not in my interest. The gentleman from Minnesota knows how much respect I have for him. I appreciate him bringing up Herbert Hoover, and Herbert Hoover did sign this Davis-Bacon Act bill. It was about the same time that he was initiating the beginnings of the old New Deal, and I don't agree with either one of those decisions of Herbert Hoover, but I will defend his legacy when he's right. This time, Herbert Hoover was wrong, and here's the reason. It is this, that we should, as consenting adults, have a protected right to enter into an agreement of our choice. If two consenting adults sit down and decide, if I want to work for my neighbor for $10 an hour, what business is it of this Congress to tell me and my neighbor that I can't do that job for $10 an hour? Under the 10th Amendment, the federalism concept, the powers that belong to the states stay with the states. This reaches across into the Constitution, and it says to the states, this revolving fund, even if they, well, this is a prevailing wage. Well, no, it's a union scale. If it were a prevailing wage, you wouldn't need to have the Department of Labor looking in to keep all of these records. I've had them come and ask me, what are we paying our people? Sometimes it's more than union scale, sometimes it's less than union scale. It depends on where the job is. But if you report the prevailing wage as a merit shop contractor, which I've spent nearly 30 years doing, you can bet that the union organizers will show up at your door. And so for that reason, smart merit shop contractors don't submit themselves to that kind of organization. They just don't report the prevailing wage. So it becomes de facto union scale. That's the reality of this. And my numbers are this. This is out of King Construction's books. The additional cost when we go into a Davis-Bacon job is between 8 and 35%. It depends on the region and it depends on the amount of materials. This reaches down into this and tells the states, you're going to have to pay this for the remaining states that do not have many Davis-Bacon laws, like Florida, like Iowa. It imposes a federal Davis-Bacon wage scale then on all of us. I have not heard a rational argument that upholds the side of the Davis-Bacon side of this, those proponents of it. I stand in support of this amendment. We cannot take away the 10th Amendment rights of our states to do business as they see fit with their money. That's a violation of the Constitution in my view. There has to be a rational argument, but I'll add one more argument to this, and that is Herbert Hoover may have signed the bill, but this is the last Jim Crow law that I know that's on the books, and that can't be defended.
Gentleman's time expired. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Michigan, member of the committee.
General lady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I was in strong opposition to this amendment because, quite simply, Davis-Bacon works. Some might say that Davis-Bacon is nothing more than a giveaway to unions, but nothing in Davis-Bacon actually requires government contractors to hire union labor. All Davis-Bacon actually does is to require that a local prevailing wage be paid to employees who do work on government infrastructure projects. And it just so happens that in many cases when Davis-Bacon is applied, that union labor is hired because they have outstanding training that warrants that the wage that is being paid is paid to them. And in the end, most importantly, good work is done on public projects. Let us also remember for a moment what actually happened after Hurricane Katrina, when then President Bush suspended Davis-Bacon during the emergency rebuilding. And during that time, Mr. Speaker, we saw local workers turned away in favor of immigrant labor from other areas, many of them workers who were in this country illegally. It got so bad that after Katrina that I joined a number of my Republican colleagues in going to President Bush to implore him to restore Davis-Bacon protections. President Bush then rescinded his earlier order, and the people of the Gulf Coast got the jobs that they needed, and the rebuilding went much smoother. And I will say this, when government work is being done in Michigan, I want highly skilled Michigan building trades workers to get those jobs. Mr. Speaker, again, very simply, Davis-Bacon works, and I would urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back her time. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself the remaining time.
The gentleman is recognized. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in listening to the arguments earlier, a gentleman spoke about Lee County, Florida. Well, let me tell you what he didn't say. He didn't talk about the thousands of people that are out of work and who would like to have a job, that lost their job in the construction industry, and they would like to go back to work. With the Davis-Bacon provision in this bill, we won't be able to hire as many people as we would like. That means fewer jobs, fewer opportunity for the families that live in Southwest Florida and all over this country. Mr. Chairman, at a time when we are debating the solutions to jumpstart our economy and the importance of job creation, the Democrat majority has incorporated provision in this bill that would just do the opposite. Repealing Davis-Bacon would create jobs, save money, and allow for more critical projects to be completed. Including this provision in the bill means fewer jobs for fewer workers at a time when we want more people to have more opportunity. But, Mr. Chairman, it comes as little surprise when in the same week the majority would ram through these Davis-Bacon provisions, they would introduce the card check bill. These reckless policies promote inefficiency and end up hammering all of our constituents. I hope this Congress will once and for all eliminate the outdated barrier to job creation. Mr. Chairman, we need to leave Davis-Bacon and these failed Depression-era policies where it belongs, in the history books. I urge all members to vote for my amendment to strip the Davis-Bacon provisions and to stand up for the American people, not big labor. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Minnesota.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. And I appreciate the comments from my colleague from Florida who talked about the Employee Free Choice Act in the same breath as the Davis-Bacon, because it is part and parcel of the same thing. There has been a concerted war against organized labor for years. Workers have been discriminated against when they've tried to organize. They have been cheated. They've been fired with little penalties. And look at what happened during Katrina when the Davis-Bacon provisions were suspended. That didn't trickle down to provide more family wage jobs. It provided more minimum wage jobs and profit all up and down the food chain. I invite people to look at the disaster, what was the disaster, by suspending these worker provisions. Mr. Speaker, we in Oregon had a spirited, robust statewide referendum on this issue, and by a 60-to-40 vote, our citizens, supported by a conservative Republican governor, decided they wanted these worker provisions.
Gentleman's time's expired.
They're important, and I hope we keep
Gentleman's
them.
time's expired. Gentleman from Minnesota.
I thank the gentleman for his statement. I yield myself the balance of time.
The gentleman is recognized for 3.5 minutes.
This is the kind of debate we should have, based on facts, based on reality in the workplace, but deeply felt views on issues, and why I insisted at in committee and at the Rules Committee that the gentleman from Florida be allowed to offer this amendment in place at this point and early on in consideration of this bill. It's appropriate to have this discussion. I have great respect for the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, who spoke earlier. We've worked together on a great many issues. He, too, speaks from the heart and from his experience on a range of business matters. And far be it from me to defend Herbert Hoover but there are a few things in Hoover's repertoire that are worthy to note. He launched aviation security as Secretary of Commerce in 1926. He signed Davis-Bacon. He established a Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Not all of Hoover was bad, as he is associated with the Great Depression. But the gentleman from Iowa has left the floor, but I couldn't help noting that the prevailing wage in Sioux City for iron workers, $20.95. That's the average. That's not the union wage. That's prevailing wage. For a truck driver is $18.25 in Sioux City, compared to a truck driver prevailing wage in Minnesota, in my district, in Lake County, $10.86. The prevailing wage varies all over the country, depending on what the local labor survey shows. This is not a national wage. This is not a negotiated wage. This is the best they do in that particular area and this particular skill. For the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mack, a backhoe operator, prevailing wage is $11.04. A backhoe operator in northeastern Minnesota gets $14.64. A backhoe operator in Mr. Micah's district gets $10.35. Union wage is about double that. These are not confiscatory wages. They're just barely staying ahead of the minimum wage. I know what it's like to work as a laborer. I worked on laborer jobs when I was going through college, carrying a hod of mud for a bricklayer, puddling concrete on a street laying job, laying pipe for the water for the sewage treatment plant in my hometown at $1.25 an hour. That was below the minimum wage because we didn't have a union contractor on the job. We ought to pay people a decent wage, a living wage. All we're asking for is the prevailing wage. And when the gentleman from Florida, the ranking member, said earlier, this is an expansion, technically yes, because the law expired. The Republican majority allowed this legislation, state revolving loan fund, to expire. It was last authorized in 1994, and they allowed it to expire, and it hadn't been authorized since then. So technically you can say, yeah, it's new. It's new legislation. We're just restoring what was.
Gentleman's time's expired.
This amendment should be defeated.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose, gentleman from Florida, rise?
Chairman, to ask unanimous consent to reclaim my 30 seconds to thank the chairman.
Is there objection? So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I did want to, I failed to mention earlier that in the committee, when I brought this amendment forward, Chairman Oberstar was gracious and kind to allow for this debate to happen on the floor, and I think that shows great character. I want to thank him for his efforts to help to have the debate on the floor so we could let the people in the United States hear what the Congress is up to on this amendment, and thank you so much.
The gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I ask for your recorded vote.
Gentleman from Florida asks for recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 8.